Our guest today is Naomi Jacobs, who has taught at Washington University in St. Louis, as well as a community educator in St. Louis and the Boulder area. She is the author of Delicious Prose, Telling the Tale of Tobit with Food and Drink, and a contributor to the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Naomi Jacobs. Thank you, Naomi, for being with us today.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me here on this virtual session. I'll be sharing some information about the history and development of some of the important aspects of the Haggadah and the Seder rituals that accompany it. So the Haggadah we use today is really one of several types that existed and evolved over time. It contains material as early as the Hebrew Bible through medieval times. So this slide shows some of the important sources. So material from the Hebrew Bible includes, among other things, the Psalms that we sing during the Hallel, verses that are quoted as part of a very famous midrash that I'll be talking about, material related to the four children, and a lot more. The Mishnah, that's a discussion of how to observe the commandments, edited in 200 CE, has an entire unit dedicated to Passover called Pesachim. And this includes the rudiments of how to celebrate a Seder, what counts as bitter herbs, and a lot more. Further discussion is found in two Talmuds. The more commonly known is the Babylonian Talmud, or the Bavli, and this was edited in 600 CE. But there's also the Land of Israel Talmud, which is also important, edited in 400 CE, also known as the Yerushalmi. Both of these contain the Mishnah and a commentary called the Gemara. And we'll find that in studying the history of the four questions, the Land of Israel Talmud is an especially important source. Now, the Gaonic period from 600 to 1000 CE, during which leading rabbis lived in around Babylonia, is of special relevance to the Haggadah, as we'll see in a minute. And it's a time where a number of important innovations took place. The most recent parts of the Haggadah come from the medieval period, which was also marked by numerous developments to the Seder. So this slide shows a timeline of some of the dates that are relevant to understanding the history of the Haggadah. So it shows that actually the earliest complete Haggadah came about in the Gaonic period, linked with Sadia Gaon, who died in 942 CE and lived under Muslim rule, but it continued to evolve over the next 700 years or more. The Maccabean revolt of 167 to 164 BCE is important to possibly understanding one of the midrashim in the Haggadah. Hillel, who's the famous sage who's linked with the special Passover sandwich we'll talk about, he dies in 10 CE. A major importance for understanding the Seder is the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, followed a very failed rebellion against the Romans, major implications for what the Seder becomes. And then there was a second failed rebellion against Rome, led by Bar Kokhba from 131 to 135 CE. And that is going to help us understand a passage in the Haggadah that is, it's a bit of a surprise if you haven't heard the story yet. Crusades of 1095 to 1291 also have left their mark. Rambam, also known as Maimonides, who died in 1204, also provides important evidence for the history and development of the Haggadah. And the most recent additions come from the 15th, 16th century. There's some changes a little bit later too. So before the temple was destroyed, what people did, they would have the Passover offering slaughtered in the temple, and then they'd gather together in a group and eat it. And while it was sacrificed, they would sing certain psalms, 131 to 116. For example, Beit Say Yisrael is Psalm 114. And the idea of telling the story of Passover derives from Exodus 13:8, which states, "On that day, tell your child, I do that because of what the Eternal did for me when I came out of Egypt." And we have some evidence from a firsthand from the famous Jewish first century philosopher from Egypt, Philo. And he writes about it. It's interesting what he says. So he talks about having a feast by someone who's providing it, and that they do it and they share it together. And he mentions, just like I said, that you link it with prayer and songs of praise. But one of the things he also stresses is that it's not what we calls not like other entertainments to gratify their bellies with wine and meat. And he's probably thinking of the Greek symposium, which where people drank a lot of wine and also talked, but it was also kind of a revelry kind of experience. Ironically enough, the Seder did come to resemble a Greek symposium after the temple was destroyed. And that's just a way that Jews typically will absorb things from other cultures and make it their own. For example, matzo balls come from Germany. I actually had a matzo ball when I was in Germany in a cafeteria, and it wasn't in soup. But that's what they go on. They take things from Greek culture, make them uniquely Jewish. So in a typical Greek symposium, though, you have lengthy discussions that take place after the meal. Now, the temple is gone, the discussion is becoming even more important, and so the meal gets postponed. Many of the rituals found in the Haggadah are described in the Mishnah and in both Talmuds, but some of them developed over time. And this slide shows a picture from a vase painting of a Greek symposium. And we still have the wine as a key component and this discussion. So Judaism and Greek culture, there's a lot of things that got in. It wasn't just a simple opposition like we see in the Hanukkah story. It wasn't like no Greek stuff at all. It was a mix, just like we engage with American culture. So the earliest Haggadah existed in two types, Babylonian and Land of Israel, just like the Talmuds. And the Haggadah that we use today is the Babylonian. So why don't we use the Land of Israel one anymore? Well, it was abandoned after the time of the Crusades, and we think this happened because it contained rituals that were used among a rival sect of Jews called the Karaites. The Karaites exist to this day. I've met one. They don't follow the oral law of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So they'll eat dairy with chicken. They won't light candles on Friday night. They're very literal. And there was such a fierce division between rabbinic and Karaite Jews that the rabbinic Jews moved away from the Land of Israel Haggadah. That it's a very interesting source that we'll continue to use as explaining some of the customs. Babylonian Haggadah splits into three types, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Yemenite. We'll be focusing on the Ashkenazi. And this slide gives us a picture of Sadia Gan. He's wearing a turban, which is typical under Muslim law. If you look at pictures of other people in Muslim rule, they wear those nice turbans. He died, as I said, in 942 CE. He also lived in Egypt and in Baghdad. And the Haggadah was formed as part of his prayer book. So we can all thank Sadia, very important rabbi, for being the earliest Haggadah that we know. There might have been earlier ones, but that's the one that we know about. Now, wait, sorry. Excuse me, my slides kind of slip around. I haven't been able to control them entirely. So anyway, we're now going to talk about some of the highlights of the Haggadah and their history, and we're going to follow the order of the Haggadah. So we have this very handy outline of the Seder, Kadesh, or Chatz, etc. And it actually is not in the earliest form of Haggadah. In fact, it was added in France either by Rashi, who lived from 1040 to 1105, the famous commentator, or by Rabbi ben Samuel of Falaise, 12th to 13th centuries. And in fact, there's certain parts of this that these practices didn't even exist into medieval times, that you wouldn't find at the earliest seders. So number one, Kaddish, recite the Kiddush. We're gonna talk about what happens if the Seder takes place on a Saturday night. We've got a special situation here, and I'll talk about what we do. Orchatz, we're going to talk about why we wash the hands and why we don't say a blessing. 3, Karpas, we're going to talk about what the green vegetable. We'll talk about how that came about and how it developed. Yachatz, number 4, breaking the middle matzah and hiding half for the afikomen. We'll talk about when this custom developed, and here's a little hint. It's a lot later than you might think. Rachsa, wash the hands. Motzi matzah, say the hamotzi with a special blessing. Maror, eat the bitter herb. We're going to be discussing the origin of bitter herbs and the controversy surrounding horseradish. Yes, horseradish was not something everyone wanted to be doing. Korech, we're going to about eating the bitter herb and the matzah together. We'll talk about what our earliest source is for this interesting story. Shulchan Aruch, serve the festive meal. Safun, eat the afikomen. And we'll talk about where that came from too, and why children had to wait many, many centuries before they could play their game. Barech, grace after meal. Hallel, we'll talk about an interesting historical tidbit that is linked to some of the Psalms. Nirtzah, conclude the Seder. We'll go over the history of the famous concluding words and talk about many of the songs that are sung at the end, a lot of which came about totally independently of the Haggadah, and some of them had nothing to do with Passover. So, why is there a bunny rabbit on so many Haggadah? Is it about Easter? No. Although it is true that the custom of dyeing eggs was originally a Jewish Passover custom that the Christians stole from us. True fact. But that's not why the bunny's here. It's a way it's a mnemonic for the order of the blessings if the Seder takes place on a Saturday night, because you've got a problem here. You've got to deal with ending Shabbat and beginning the holiday. And there's a huge debate in the Bavli that goes on. I studied this in my day school. It takes hours to figure out their logic here, but they finally figured out what order we say the blessings. So the first thing we do is we bless the wine, the yain, for Kiddush and Havdalah. Then you do the actual Kiddush to sanctify the festival. Then you do Ner, the blessing of the Havdalah candle, and then the prayer of Havdalah to separate from Shabbat, and then Shechianu. If you take the initial sounds of each blessing, we get something that sounds like Jag den Has, and that's German for hunting the rabbit. So scenes of rabbit hunting, sometimes with dogs, are actually common in non-Jewish medieval manuscripts. Is another illustration of us borrowing from the culture. But in this case, the Jewish sympathies lie with the bunny, a rabbit. He's a clever proto-Bugs Bunny. He's escaping the hunters. And our bunny here comes from a 14th century Spanish Haggadah. Isn't he cute? Yes. Now we come to a topic that people have asked over and over again at Seders I have been at, and I've wondered myself. So why are we washing our hands without saying a blessing? Well, the truth is we actually did say a blessing for quite a while. The Mishnah says we're supposed to say a blessing because when you're washing your hands, you need to do that if you're dipping food into a liquid, because there's an idea that the liquid can transfer impurity. This is something we also see in at least one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But by medieval times, this strict view of impurity no longer held, according to 13th century Rabbi Meir Wathenberg. So washing isn't necessary, but often in Jewish customs, we try to be inclusive and we try to honor past tradition. So washing without a blessing is a compromised position. We wash to honor the ancient ritual, but we don't make a blessing as it's no longer necessary. But actually, you can still see that blessing in Haggadah as late as 1527. It finally was gone for good by the 17th century. As you can see, we're doing it for quite a while. So karpas in Greek means the fruit of the land. It's a generic term for any leafy vegetable, but we actually don't see this term until a 13th century French Haggadah. A lot of innovations seem to have happened in France. And originally karpas was lettuce, and it wasn't dipped in salt water. It was actually dipped in the haroset, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But because lettuce is also going to be used as a bitter herb, we talk about that in our history of bitter herbs, they wanted to avoid blessing the lettuce twice, so they used a different vegetable. And since the Mishnah doesn't describe haroset appearing until the main meal, that is not in the appetizer phase, famous rabbis Rabbeinu Tam and Rashbam from 12th century France just chose vinegar as an option instead. And that later became salt water, although some Yemenite Jews will still dip the karpas into haroset for the first time that we dip. Also, differently from today, in the land of Israel at this stage, Jews would eat not just karpas and dip, but a lot of appetizer food, such as vegetables, fruits, eggs, and cakes. So if you have hungry children or someone with diabetes at your Seder, you don't have to starve yourself. You can eat a little more at this stage while remaining traditional. Yachats, breaking the middle matzah, carries such a huge symbolic weight. It's so important. We can hardly imagine having a Seder without it. And it's actually a medieval development. It's not mentioned at all in Sadia's Haggadah. Rambam Maimonides from 1130s, 1204, he doesn't talk about it either. We do have Rabbi Hai Gaon, 939 to 1038, who says that breaking's unnecessary, which suggests maybe some people were doing it, but it didn't really fully come about until the 13th century to convey the idea of brokenness and arouse the curiosity of children. So that is also tied up with where afikomen comes from, which we'll talk about in due course. The Mishnah, as I said, is an incredibly important source. And this whole passage here is taken wholesale, straight from the Mishnah, that in every generation, we're supposed to regard ourselves as personally come from Egypt, because we should tell our child on that day because of what God did. We're obligated to give praise to God, who brought us out of slavery, freedom, anguish to joy, and so on. And so you can see this sort of encapsulates the essence of the Seder, the personal inner attitude, the blessings, the intergenerational teaching, and the transitions. And it's great that we can see this all the way back in the Mishnah, coming straight from that. Okay, bitter herbs. So the Mishnah is our teacher about bitter herbs. And it says that there are actually 5 herbs that will fulfill the obligation. Number 1 is chazeret, which is a bitter form of wild lettuce. Number 2 is ulshin, which is endives. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in the Bible too, and it happened in the Mishnah. We have words, we don't know what plants they're actually referring to. We don't know what tamcha, charchavina, or marwor are. And hold the thought, because we're going to get back to that in a second. So typically, the most commonly used ones historically are lettuce and endives, not horseradish. Horseradish is a later development, and it came about because lettuce wasn't easily available in cold climates. That's the same reason why sometimes Ashkenazi Seders have potatoes for karpas, which is, if you green potato, you don't want to eat. But that was, again, because they're not having any leafy vegetables available. The first time we actually hear of horseradish, ironically enough, is not as part of a bitter herb, but it's a 12th century ingredient for haroset. That's a new twist. That's when we first hear about it. And then they wanted to figure out a way to have the horseradish in there. So they decided that this mysterious tamcha clearly must be referring to horseradish, so that we have a textual basis for it. But actually, there was a huge controversy. Many rabbis opposed its usage. It's technically more sharp than bitter, and it's not really easy to eat the right amount because it's so strong tasting. But it went back and forth. Rabbi Moshe Sefer of 1822 argued that horseradish is better. Why? Because with lettuce, you have the problem of accidentally eating bugs, which is a big problem with kashrut. But from a legal standpoint, it really seems that lettuce is the better choice. This was recently argued by contemporary Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. But some Ashkenazim just loved their horseradish so much, they kept eating it even when the lettuce was available. And so they would end up eating both. So if you've ever wondered why some Seder plates have something called for chazeret and for maror, that allows you to put both the lettuce and the maror on your Seder plate. That's a Ashkenazi Seder plate. Now we come to haroset. This has got an interesting story here. So nowadays we say it's the symbol of the mortar used by Israelite slaves to lay bricks. It didn't have that symbolic meaning at first. Apples are a typical Roman dessert. Nuts are often eaten to reduce the effects of alcohol. We first get a sense of haroset in the Mishnah. They say that they're describing the meal. So the person dips the lettuce, then they get the matzah, some more lettuce, haroset, and 2 dishes. Do they tell us what haroset is made of? No. They probably assume we already know. And they tell us, oh yeah, it's not a religious obligation. So we're still left hanging here. How do we make haroset? Okay, we have to go back here. This is another slippy slide. So fortunately, we are told about it in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. And it says that lettuce is made of apples, nuts, and wine. So we get the ingredients. No, there's no honey. And it says it resembles mortar. So that could be where it ended up thinking as a symbolic meaning, but that's not why we're eating it. According to this Rav Papa, it's quasi-medical. It's to account for the poisonous substance in the lettuce. There you have it. Haroset is for health and hygienic reasons. Okay, now we come to bread of affliction. People who don't like matzah will say that. But this isn't actually a really interesting passage and very generous about the bread of afflictions. Our ancestors ate. It's inviting hungry people to come and join the Seder. Now, one thing that's interesting about it, it's one of the 2 texts in the Haggadah that are primarily in Aramaic, not Hebrew. One of the ways you can tell something is in Aramaic is you see a lot of aleph at the end of the word. That's the way they say the in Aramaic, where Hebrew would use a hey. So that's how you can get a sense that's in Aramaic. The Haggadah is the other text that's almost entirely in Aramaic. It's not easy to assign a date to this passage on linguistics grounds, but we only find it in the Babylonian Haggadah, not in the land of Israel. It's written in Aramaic because that's the common language so that people would understand. So that's the same reason why, like, the Kaddish is also in Aramaic. Now we come to the 3 questions. The Seder is all about 4s, 4 cups of wine, 4 mothers, although really there's 6. Whoa. Well, the questions, as we knew, evolved over time. I'm going to go through 3 stages of the 4 questions. So our earliest source is that Land of Israel Talmud. Even though it's later than the Mishnah, it contains earlier material. The Talmudim are sort of like an archaeological dig. There's so many different layers from different times. So 3 questions, and pay attention here to see if you can guess which ones are not in our Seder now or how they've changed. So 1, why is it different? On all other nights, we dip only once. On this night, twice. So the question about double dipping is considered the most important difference. That's why it comes first. Dipping once was a normal dining custom at this time, so twice would have seemed unusual. Now, under 2, on all other nights we eat chametz, on this night only matzah. That sounds fairly familiar from our version of the 4 questions. But what about number 3? On other nights, we eat roasted or boiled meat, but on this night, only roasted. Hey, that's not in my Haggadah. Well, it's referring to the Passover sacrifice. The tricky thing is that the Bible actually says you could and you can have a boiled meat for the Seder. That depends on which book of the Torah you're reading. But we'll run with the roasted here. Anyway, this is our first stage. Now we have a second stage, our Mishnah. Now the order is going to be different. We're going to have changes in wording, and we're going to get a new question. So how different is this night from all other nights? For on other nights, we eat leavened or unleavened bread, but on this night, all bread is unleavened. So that's corresponds to the second question in the Yerushalmi. And also it's a little bit expanded because it talks about eating unleavened bread during a daily meal, which wasn't in the Land of Israel version. Number 2, for on all other nights, we eat diverse vegetables, but on this night, only bitter herbs. We have a new question. Why? Well, it's included to match with the emphasis of Rabban Gamaliel, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, that says that the 3 key elements are the Passover offering, the matzah, and the maror. So we have our first question is a matzah question, our second question is a maror question, and the third question is meat. We still have the meat question going here. On other night, we eat meat which is roasted, stewed, or boiled. Now we have stewed, but this night all the meal is roasted, which is still the third question in the Yerushalmi. Number 4, for on all the nights we dip our food 1 time, but on this night 2 times. So that is still present, but now it's moved to the very end because it's not as important a difference. And it's not one of the 3 things, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, that Rabban Gamliel wants. But we still don't have the form that we have now. We have to wait until the Gaonic period. So the first and second questions are like those in the Mishnah. For on other nights, we eat leavened or unleavened bread, but this night all the bread is unleavened, just like the Mishnah. Other nights we eat diverse vegetables. This night only bitter herbs. Same as the Mishnah. Now, here's a strange change. On all other nights, we do not dip our food even 1 time, but on this night, 2 times. Okay, the question before was saying that we normally dip once, but now we dip twice. So what gives here? Well, the idea that you don't dip normally shows by the time that the common dining custom of dipping an appetizer is no longer practiced. The roasted meat question is now completely eliminated because we no longer want to have anything that makes us think we're doing a Passover offering because we don't have a temple. We don't want to make it look like we're doing something like that we can't do. So similarly, nowadays, Ashkenazi Seders will never serve lamb. And Sephardi Seders serve lamb, but they won't serve the whole lamb. Again, trying to make sure that there's a distinction because we don't have a temple. And now we have a new question, reclining. On other nights we eat, sit, or recline, but on this night we all recline. Now, in Hellenistic and Roman times, reclining was a typical practice at all meals by at least the upper class. It actually originated in Assyria, and we have Prophet Amos talking about reclining, but it really went big in the Hellenistic times. So this question comes at a time in which reclining is especially linked with seders to indicate freedom, and is now a notable difference, but it wouldn't have been before because people would normally be reclining at meals a lot. So we see, as we study the evolution of the 4 questions, that there's a consistent emphasis on what's different, but due to changes in customs and practice, what constitutes a notable difference has changed. It would seem to be a very important principle that the more you tell the story, the more praiseworthy it is. I remember my rabbi, Hillel Rabbi Danny Leifer, blessed memory. I went to his Seder. It went to like 3 or 4 a.m. He definitely was about telling the story in a great detail. But this is not found in Sadia's earliest Haggadah. We can thank Maimonides for emphasizing the length. And I'm going to get to an interesting anecdote that relates to telling the story at length. And there's a lot more going on here than at the surface text. So we have Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues doing an all-nighter Seder. It says that Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Tarfon sat all night in Bnei Brak telling the story of the departure of Egypt. Towards morning, their students came to tell them that it was time for morning prayers. Okay, so here's the backstory. Well, Bnei Brak, first of all, is sort of east of modern Tel Aviv. This story is unique to the Haggadah. We do have it elsewhere, but it's different rabbis. So what's going on here is the rabbis are planning a rebellion against Rome. This is known as that Bar Kokhba rebellion from 132 to 135 CE, which was a total disaster, failed rebellion. But they don't know that as they're planning it. And why don't they know what time it is? Presumably they're hiding in caves. That's why their students have to tell to let them know that it's time for morning prayers. And my slide shows a photograph of a letter actually written by Bar Kokhba himself, found in a cave of letters. Now, that they're planning a rebellion during Passover, the Holiday of Freedom, is not an accident. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 19, 1943 also began on Passover, deliberately. Now we come to the 4 children. The Mishnah gives us the basic idea. It states in Sachim 10:4 that we should answer the child on an individual basis with respect to their knowledge, but the Mishnah doesn't give us that nice little 4 characterization. We start seeing this elsewhere. There's an important midrash called the Mekilta de Rabbi Ishmael, which is fairly old. It talks about observances from the book of Exodus. We also have a version in the Land of Israel Talmud, and it's also in All Babylon Haggadah. And many of the questions and answers use verses directly from the Torah. And the Land of Israel Talmud has some differences. So let's go through our 4 kids. So the wise child's question comes from Deuteronomy. See if I can move so we can. There we are. Deuteronomy 6:21 to 23, asking about the rules, laws, and customs. And there's no specific answer, but the parent is instructed to explain all the commandments related to Passover in full detail. Now, in the Land of Israel Talmud, this answer is given to the simple child. Interesting, huh? Now, wicked child, the question comes from Exodus 12:26. What's the meaning of this servants to you? And the answer from Exodus 13:8, which we already mentioned, what the Eternal did for me when I came forth from Egypt. In the Land of Israel Talmud, the wicked child's question is, you could make a case that the meaning of the service to you is actually a pretty good question. But what he says he or she says in the Land of Israel Talmud is, what is this inconvenience or trouble with which you inconvenience us each year? Now that's a pretty wicked question. That is a bit harder to redeem. So our simple child, similarly, the question, what is this? Answer comes from Exodus 13, with a strong hand, the Eternal brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. Anthropomorphism, that's not uncommon in the Bible. For the one who's not able to ask, we've mentioned this one already. You should tell your child on that day, this is done because what the Eternal did for me when I came forth from Egypt. We have a very powerful passage that states that in every generation, enemies have sought to wipe out the Jewish people, but God keeps saving us, not on an individual basis, unfortunately, but definitely collectively as a people. And it comes with an interesting custom where we raise our cup and cover the matzah. Then we set the cup down and uncover the matzah. What's going on? We lift the wine for unknown Kabbalistic reasons. I'm not a Kabbalist. If you are, you might know why. We cover the matzah because elevating the wine is disrespectful to the more important matzah. We don't want the matzah to be embarrassed. So that's why we do that. Okay. Now we come to the come and learn midrash, also known as the Selamad midrash. This is that long passage that tells the Passover story that you probably are familiar with. It's only found in the Haggadah, which is interesting because so many things in the Haggadah have a source. This is unique to the Haggadah. It takes a series of biblical verses from Deuteronomy 26, 5-10, and expands and reinterprets them. And we know that we're supposed to be interpreting this verse because the Mishnah clues us in and actually refers to the first verse. So even though the Mishnah doesn't have the midrash, it gives us the basis for the midrash. So Deuteronomy 26, 5-9 talks about, my father was a wandering Aramean. What is that about? That's referring to Jacob, because there's a story that he came out of the land of Syria as his originator. So then going down to Egypt, that's where we have the Joseph story. Then we have Egyptians are harsh, cry to God. God hears us, God frees us, brings us to the land of milk and honey. Now, the original context of this passage in the Deuteronomy, in the Torah, is when you're presenting first fruits produce, not linked with Passover at all. But as I said, the Mishnah clues us in to be using these verses. Now, there's something very strange in this passage. It says that an Aramean sought to kill my father, and that Laban was worse than Pharaoh. Okay, that's really weird. Okay, first of all, they have taken the Hebrew, which is Arami Oved Avi, and instead of Jacob being wandering, Jacob is now being attacked. And the way to get away with this is because the root Aleph Bet Dalet can mean either lost or destroyed. And this kind of reinterpretation of language is a comic midrashic move. They're incredibly creative with adapting texts. And it's totally kosher to take it out of context or reread it. That's standard procedure. But why are we so saying that Laban is worse than Pharaoh during a Seder? Well, there is a possible backstory here. So Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BCE, conquered Israel and a large part of the known world. After he died, his empire was split to various generals, and the two most powerful ones were based in Syria and in Egypt. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria. Cleopatra is the famous one. She's the last of the Ptolemies, but she's during the Roman period, so she wasn't ruling Israel. The Ptolemies ruled first, and the Syrian Empire is linked with Antiochus Epiphanes from the Hanukkah story, bad guy. Even though, ironically, the Seleucids were actually more tolerant than the Ptolemies. He's just this weird exception. People don't really understand why he did what he did. So what possibly this passage is saying is the Seleucids are worse than the Ptolemies, and they're doing this complicated way with Laban and Pharaoh. And I think that's probably the best way to understand why they're going in that direction. There is version of the land of Israel Talmud is a lot shorter. It doesn't have the part where it says only God, not any angel or any messenger. And that kind of emphasis is probably a form of anti-Christian polemic, because Jews are moving away from the idea that there could be an intermediary figure, human figure, between God and Israel. Even though, if you look at enough ancient texts, there are intermediary figures, and there's also Moses. And what about Moses? Does Moses occur in the Haggadah? We will talk about the one place where he does. Now, if you have an English version of the Haggadah for this Midrash, it will refer to Moses's rod, but that's not in the Hebrew. So this is not the place where Moses occurs, but we'll get there shortly, and we'll talk about why he only occurs once. Okay. Now, nowadays, we spill drops of wine or grape juice to remember the suffering of the Egyptians. And I always love that, because they're innocent. You know, we have to care. The angels were upset when they were being destroyed. No, angels were cheering, and God said, they're my creation too. But actually, that's not why we did it originally. It started as a magical custom to prevent the plagues from harming us. And if you think of medieval times, there were, bubonic plague. Plagues were a real thing. We know about that too. Later got reinterpreted. And so this is what we call apotropaic, preventing harm. It's just like breaking a glass at a wedding. Yes, that's a magical custom too. We first see people spilling wine for 10 plagues in 12th century Ashkenazic sources. And in typical Jewish fashion, they debate whether you spill directly from a cup, do you do it with a finger? And if so, what finger? We care about all these details. Okay, now we have Moses's name mentioned. We have a whole bunch of passages that try to claim that the plagues were actually more. So Rabbi Joseph the Galilean is saying that it's really 50 plagues because you have the strong hand, which God showed against Egypt, and there are 5 fingers on each hand. Multiply 5 by 10, you've got 50 plagues. This passage comes from that Mechilta to Rabbi Ishmael Midrash I said before, but originally Moses's name would not be present. Why? Well, Midrashic works typically do not cite the entire verse. They only cite the first few words. They assume either you know what the rest of the verse is, and it's also probably a good way to save space. And so we look in that form, Moses's name is not there. And if you look at Haggadahs from the Geogonic period, they only do this partial quote, and Moses's name is not there. But starting in the 14th century, they start putting the full verse, maybe presumably because people didn't have it in their head. So why do we minimize Moses? If he's so important in the Torah, why isn't he important in the Haggadah? Well, it's in keeping with emphasizing God's role, and it's also going against various moves by some to try to make Moses divine. And we want to really move away from that in light of Christianity, because we do not believe that humans are divine. We have God divineness inside us, but we're not divine itself. And that Philo, who I mentioned at the very beginning, he was trying to do that. And we don't want to do that. So hence Moses gets downplayed in the Haggadah. I don't think he minds. He was a humble man anyway. Dayenu. Okay, this is pretty famous passage. It was considered optional in Saadia Gaon's 10th century Haggadah. What's really interesting is that there's an anti-Jewish sermon by a guy named Melito of Sardis, not a nice guy. He died in 180 CE, and he actually goes through the same order. This doesn't show everything for the Dayenu. It goes in the same order of topics, claiming the Jews are ungrateful. So it's very, very likely that the Dayenu was written as a response to this anti-Semitic, you could say, text by claiming, to the contrary, we are extremely grateful. So yeah, Jews are engaging with their wider culture, and Christianity is a big one for them to be engaging with. Now we mentioned that Rabban Gamliel, the person who said that we're supposed to emphasize the Passover offering, the matzah and maror. And again, our source for this is the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, it gets further expanded in the Haggadah, but again, it just shows us how important the Mishnah is as a source for Passover. But we have a big question here. Which Rabban Gamliel? Okay, there were actually 6 different Gamaliels. All of them were related to each other. In Judaism, there was a custom of naming children after their grandfathers. And you just have generation of alternating 2 names. So, but our best candidates for Gamaliel are these 2 men. Gamaliel 1 is the grandson of Hillel, and he was the head of the legal authority known as the Sanhedrin, but he died before the destruction of the temple by 20 years. So Gamaliel 2, his grandson, who led the Sanhedrin after the destruction of the temple, is a better candidate, because that was at the time when they started really caring about the precise rules for the Seder, when there's no longer a temple. Now, the sandwich in English comes from the Earl of Sandwich, who was a gambler and didn't want to leave the gambling tables, but we invented it first. And Hillel here puts together bitter herbs together and eats them as a sandwich. Now, Hillel is one of the earlier figures. We actually don't call him a rabbi. He's more of like he and Shammai don't have that title yet. So you would think to find this in the Mishnah, because that's where that's an earlier source. But actually, and I don't know if you can hear rain, but that's coming out of my window. I'm sorry if you can hear the rain, but enjoy the relaxing sound. It comes actually from the land of Israel and the Babylonian Talmudim. So it's interesting, it's not in our earliest sources about Hillel, but it got preserved as a tradition in the Talmuds. At a certain stage in modern Hebrew, they were trying to come up for a word for sandwich, and nowadays it's harich or sandwich, but at a certain stage they tried to name it after Hillel, Hillelit or something. Unfortunately, that did not survive into modern Hebrew. Okay, I'm going to go back here. Okay, afikomen, it's got a history. We first find the term in the Mishnah, and it means something entirely different. It's not talking about food. It's saying after the Passover meal, you don't conclude with afikomen, which means you don't conclude with after dinner revelry, which you can imagine what that might refer to. It was known as epikomos in Greek. But the idea of closing a meal with a taste of matzah came about much later. It wasn't called afikomen until the 13th century. It's a way of changing something negative into positive. And we don't conclude with eating the afikomen. We have some other things afterwards. So we're reinterpreting the Mishnah to align with our customs, so that we always have a textual basis for what we're doing. And we mentioned already that splitting the middle matzah also comes from the 13th century. So kids had to wait a while before they get to have the game. Elijah's cup. Traditionally, Elijah was supposed to be able to solve all unresolved debates. about how to practice Judaism. Often the rabbis would come to an impasse and they're like, I don't know, what should we do? I guess we'll have to wait for Elijah to come. And his cup is here because of a debate. Should you have 4 cups or 5 cups at the Seder? See, if you have 4 cups plus Elijah, you can make it either 4 or 5 by counting him or not. And these cups are linked with special verbs. That's linked with Passover from Exodus 6:6-8. I shall take you out, v'hotzeti. I shall rescue you, v'tzalti. I shall redeem you, v'ga'alti. I shall take you, v'lakachti. And should we do, I shall bring you, v'heveti? That's the debate, 4 or 5. And of course, there's 4 is such a big thing with the Seder that it kind of, you would think that you might want 4. Now, if you compare Elijah to Santa Claus, right now he has a very, very narrow window to come in the Seders and drink our wine. But initially he had a lot more time because the door was kept open for the entire Seder. This was changed, as you may well imagine, for security reasons. Poor Elijah, he just has to be really fast. We have this very, very strong and powerful statement, pour out your wrath, asking for about nations who have consumed the Jewish people and asking that they be destroyed. Why is it here? What is the context? This cry for destruction against harmful Gentiles, which is a mix of Psalm 79:69 and Lamentations 3:6-6, comes from the time of the Crusades, 1095 to 1291, when many Jews and Muslims were slaughtered in Europe by crusaders on the way to the land of Israel. It was known as a custom in Germany by Rabbi Elazar Worms, who died in 1238, and is well attested in the 13th century. Worms, along with Mainz and Speyer in Germany, were especially hard hit in the Crusades. Now, there are all alternatives available. A 19th century Haggadah by Israel Levi speaks instead of all nations turning to God. And there's also an alternate prayer to pour out your love on righteous Gentiles found in a 16th century manuscript from Worms. Whether we choose to state this out loud, it's important to remember the circumstances of those who endured such persecution. We sing the Hallel just as we do for other major festivals, consisting of various psalms. And I wanted to point out a very interesting term. They're the year Adonai. Like you say, Yom Runa, Yom Runa, Yom Runa, Yireh Adonai. It refers to a class of people known as God-fearers. Who are these people? They're people who, we have some people like this today, people who attend synagogue but have not formally converted, both men and women. Judaism was a very popular religion among non-Jews for a period. But for example, men might not want to undergo circumcision. Now, synagogue dedications were as much a thing as antiquity as they are today. We did not invent, this is not a modern thing. So, right, I have here for you on this slide a mosaic from Sardis, Turkey, dating between 200-400 CE, in which a God-fearer dedicates a menorah. His name was Aurelius Ologius, and in Greek, God-fearer is Theosebis, and he had taken a vow and fulfilled it and then sponsored a menorah. Very generous. So you can think of all these God-fearer people. There are synagogues linked with God-fearers too. So pretty cool. Okay, now we're going to come to some of the concluding songs and the Seder conclusion, and then afterwards I'll do the final songs. Some of these are a little obscure, but they're kind of interesting. So It Happened at Midnight is a composition that reviews a series of wonders by God relating to Abraham, Laban, can't get rid of Laban here, Jacob, Assyrians, Daniel, Haman, and Ahasuerus, all of which the composer tells us took place at midnight. And we did not know this previously. This is kind of a very creative way of dealing with these events. And after each verse, you get the words "it happened at midnight." One of these wonders refers to the firstborn of Egypt in a single line, and that's probably what spurred it to get included in the Haggadah. But actually, this piece was not written for Passover. It was written for the Amidah for Shabbat. And the author is a famous person named Yanai. He wrote a special prayers called Piyutim that are in the Ashkenazi High Holiday Prayer Book. And we aren't sure when he lived, possibly 6th century CE. This is the Passover offering, has a very similar style. And that's not surprising because it's written by a student of Yanai's named Rabbi Elazar Clear. And between each paragraph, it's got, this is the Passover offering. And it states, again, we had no way of knowing this otherwise, that many important events took place on Passover that aren't mentioned in the Bible. For example, the angels visited Abraham on Passover, and the walls of Jericho fell on Passover. And so he's really sort of modeling it on his teacher. Okay, to whom it is fitting. Kilo na kilo ya. So that song that goes through the different attributes of God, somewhat in the order of the alphabet, just like we see in Psalms and Ashrei, not originally linked with Passover. It's actually a special kind of mystical writing known as Haggadah literature, which involves rabbis going on super scary trips to heaven. And some of it's trying to get you into a trance. A lot of this literature does that. And we first see it getting into a Haggadah in 13th century England. Now, the Seder is concluded. We have a nice statement, ended is the Passover Seder, according to custom, statute, and law. As we are worthy to celebrate it this year, so may we perform it in future years. O pure one in heaven above, restore the congregation of Israel in your love. Speedily lead your redeemed people to Zion in joy. That, even though it's in Hebrew now, it actually was written originally in French. It derives from a long French poem in the 11th century by Rabbi Joseph Tour-Elam, and it took several hundred years to enter the Haggadah, 15th century. Okay, now we come to the 3 concluding songs. So, Adirhu, which is a wish to have the temple rebuilt, comes from medieval Germany and was first published with music in 17th century Haggadah. Who Knows One and Haggadah are our most recent additions. Who Knows One was earlier a table song, not for Passover, but for Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret in Avignon. It was also sung at weddings in Cochin in Senegal. We first see it in the Prague Haggadah in 1590, although there are earlier versions that exist, one of which has the Shema as a refrain between the numbers. This type of counting song has numerous cross-cultural parallels. There's something called the Formula of Bucharius, Bishop of Lyon in the 5th century CE that is a very early version of this as a counting song. Haggadah. According to the Torah, you can have a Passover sacrifice of a lamb and a goat. So that could be a way it got linked in here, but originally as not linked with Passover. It's first found in a book of legal practices and ethics by Elazar Vermes, who I mentioned earlier. He died in 1238, and it's a book called Sefer Rokeach, and it builds on earlier Midrashic themes. We first start seeing it Haggadah in the 15th and 16th century in both Aramaic and Yiddish. Some people think that the Aramaic may have been translated from the Yiddish. It's very strange Aramaic. There are a lot of different kinds of Aramaic, and this one is not by someone who actually spoke Aramaic. And there are some actual variations around the world. So our Haggadah has the kid eaten by a cat. Cat is eaten by a dog. Then we have a stick, fire, water, ox, shochet, angel of death, and the Holy One. But there's two versions where we have rodents. In one of them, the goat is eaten by a mouse. I'm not sure how, but and then the mouse is eaten by a cat. Another one, we have the cat is not the second item. The kid is eaten by a dog. Then we have stick. Then we have fire and water, just like what we're familiar with. But then we have a rope, which is eaten by a rat, a rodent again, and the rat is eaten by a cat. Now, it's common in Jewish practice to take secular songs and use them for religious songs, just like most national anthems come from drinking songs. But there's something considered very special. The Marseillaise was actually considered a very important religious tune. So this tune comes from a familiar, in Ashkenazi Seders, comes from a familiar German song, Ein Männlein steht im Wald, a little man stands in the forest. It's from a famous opera by Humperdinck called Hansel and Gretel, which is ironic because it's chametz, they're using breadcrumbs. But that's where the song comes from. And cross-cultural parallels include This Is the House That Jack Built, which might likewise date to the 15th century. Another way Jews are using non-Jewish models, but to make it uniquely their own. These are a few of the elements of the Haggadah. We've seen that the text of the Haggadah and the many customs we perform today have a rich and multi-layered history with some ancient sources and wordings, but also that many aspects we take for granted didn't emerge until the medieval period. This mixture of old and new is like a time capsule into Jewish history. If you enjoy looking at the different layers, I recommend looking at a special Haggadah called the Polychrome Haggadah, which attempts to show different material using different colors. It's a bit hard to come by. There was a fire that destroyed a lot of them, but you might be able to find it in a synagogue library or another library. Thank you so much. Have a kasher v'sameach, and even in this intense times, may be a comfort as it's been throughout Jewish history. Thank you.
Thank
Rebecca,
you
you
so
still
much, Naomi. This was a fascinating lecture, and I'm going to take from somebody else. This was a wonderful journey of finding our Haggadah roots, and I learned so much, and I'm sure our folks did too. And the timing of this program is, perfect for us. And what a lesson in history! And I can't thank you enough for this time and the hour that you spent with us. I do hope that you will join us again at a later date for another topic, because this was really lovely. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. Hag Sameach, happy Passover,